if you would like to, you can refer to this on YouTube. Yes, Leanna, I am offering everybody to send me their paper, a portion of the paper, whatever prior, so I can give you some feedback. It is an invitation to take that. I need a minimum of, I'm going to say 72 hours before the paper is due. So if you're sending it to me at midnight on the 28th and expect meaningful feedback, I'm going to be PO'd on that. And I'll probably just send you back an email and say, this is very entitled of you. Okay. Yes, but give me 3 days, just a little bit of a buffer with that. Okay. I'm going to minimize all of you. So as always, if you have anything, please speak up, raise your virtual hand. I'm going to keep it like this because I have some notes on one slide in particular that I'm definitely going to need to read because it's talking about different areas of the brain. So today we're going to be talking about behavioral addictions. I want to do some reflection this week on just some of your thoughts on some of the different behaviors. I want to talk a little bit about the DSM. All of you know some of my feelings on the DSM. So I try to not sway so much, but I also always want to be transparent with you about where I'm at. But I always encourage you to have your own opinion on this kind of stuff. And then we're going to talk, I'm going to be essentially building on Camelia's lecture from week 11 or 12 on EFT. So we're going to be talking about EFT specifically for sexual addictions. Okay, so some of the behaviors that we're going to be talking about today. So as we know, or as you may remember in your introduction to psychopathology class, that gambling is the only addiction that is listed in the DSM. So as we know, the DSM is informed by research, and really the people who have the final say of the DSM basically say that all these other compulsive behaviors, there's just not enough data. There's not enough information to put together criteria for a diagnosis. But we'll be talking about buying, hoarding, eating disorders, obsessive sexual behavior. Eating disorders, as you know, have a separate, have essentially their own section within the DSM. So there is some crossover with some compulsive behaviors, internet use, game playing, TV watching, shoplifting, hair pulling. As we know, trichotillomania is in a different section. Fire setting is in compulsive behavior. What is it? Compulsive and disruptive. I think disruptive behaviors. I'm trying to think of what the category is. So pyromania, essentially. Right here, impulse control disorders. And so obsessive compulsive disorder. So hoarding, for example, is in anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorders, that section. But what we know is there's a lot of similarities with substance use and process addictions or behavioral addictions. So when people are asked, and what we know from clinical work is as the reasons why people engage in behaviors like this is the rush, some of the adrenaline. So again, we talk about that with substances. Boredom, as we know, is one of the most pervasive, triggering emotions for an individual to use or to engage in addictive behavior. A way to escape or forget problems. So we'll talk about this next week, but a big indicator of future use is how early an individual begins using, even if it's, of course, it doesn't begin as an addiction. Some people, as we know, are genetically more at risk of developing an addiction. But one of the things to keep in mind when you're working with individuals who have any sort of addiction, again, if it's substance or process, is that when they really start using in an abusive or problematic dependent type approach, oh, sorry. Here we go. That chronologically, they're kind of locked into that age. So you may be working with a 35-year-old adult who is emotionally and coping wise 16. So there is lots of truth to the kind of stopping of maturing, because as we know, as you grow, you go through trials and tribulations and you learn some tolerance for uncertainty, and you have breakups and losses and these difficult things that you navigate, generally mostly sober, or mostly in a way that's not engaging in some sort of compulsive behavior. And that helps you to gain some confidence in your ability to, weather the storm or ride the wave. And so when you're working with an individual who has for their entire adult life used a substance or engaged in a behavior in order to essentially temper or cope with negative affect or a difficult situation, an interpersonal conflict, they're really not going to have the tools to be able to navigate that situation sober. So, or again, without engaging in the compulsive behavior. So another reason for getting problems, dealing with any sort of difficult situation, controlling anxiety and depression. So again, those difficult emotions, that's probably the number one, not probably, it is the number one reason for use, is moving away from or coping with negative affect. Altering their state of consciousness. So again, this could be for, the high of it, the euphoria that is generally pretty short-lived, to escape, to cope. And then what we do know is generally, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about this, is that the same areas of the brain, so we know this through fMRIs, are activated when an individual is either using a substance, seeing an image of a substance, seeing paraphernalia, seeing a picture of a slot machine, things like that. So if, you have one person who engages in gambling, problematic gambling behaviors, and a person who engages in stimulant use, when they see images of their respective addictions, their brains look very similar on an fMRI. Okay, so one of the things, I'm going to stop my share here, but if you can, for those of you who may have the PowerPoint pulled up, looking at those different behaviors, those different behavioral addictions that we'll be covering tonight. I'm curious, I'm going to put you guys in breakout rooms for a little bit, give you a chance to talk with one another, if any self of the therapist issues come up. So remember how when we did the self of the therapist paper, talking specifically about substance use, that, you had different opinions based on the substance, which is normal. So I want to see your thought process and how you feel about different behavioral addictions or different compulsive behaviors, and how you may navigate that. So if you have different feelings of so again, if you had somebody presenting to you with an addiction to gambling, or someone who was presenting to you with an addiction to sex, might you look at these two individuals differently? And if so, what is it about these? Would it be different for you if a woman, for example, presented to you with a sex addiction, or if a man presented to you with a sex addiction, if maybe a married individual presented to you with a sex addiction, if a single individual presented to you? So all of those possibilities, I want to give you guys a chance to just kind of talk through these. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so I'll put you in breakout rooms. 3 or 4 of you as always. Let me see, Camelia, where you are. You're in a room of 4, so we're good. Okay, I'm going to give you guys 20 minutes to talk about this, and then we'll take about 10 minutes to talk about it as a group, and then we'll take our first break. I'll see you guys in 20 minutes.
Question,
Sure.
just about, like, we had assumptions, but we wanted to hear what you said kind of about when all those compulsive behaviors become an addiction, like what actually would be this criteria for them to become an addiction?
So really what it boils down to is everyday functioning. Like, are they able to be present at work? Are they able to attend to the duties of and responsibilities of their life? Like, are they engaging in hygiene? If they're a parent, are they attending to their children? Because there isn't set criteria like in the DSM for a diagnosis, there's a lot of subjectivity in that, because addiction really has 2 components. There's I would say addiction is better conceptualized in how the DSM-4 text revised did substance use and those addictions of dependence and abuse. Because addiction and abuse, those aren't the same things, but addiction and dependence are really on the same wavelength. So like if you are unable to function without it, or it is impairing your functioning in other areas, I would say that that is subjectively, with things that are not in the DSM, that would be like problematic behavior, or that could be considered addiction. So there's a lot of criticisms of how the DSM-5 and the DSM-5 text revised, which came out in March, conceptualize or have the criteria for use disorders, because they don't differentiate. It doesn't differentiate between dependence and abuse. So it's like it almost like catches too many or not enough. Because so I would argue I abused alcohol in college, but I've never been dependent on it. Like I never needed it to cope. I never took the hair of the dog the next day to be able to go to class or anything like that. But I would likely not meet criteria for substance use, but it may have been helpful, I don't know, in some way for it to be acknowledged to me that I was abusing alcohol. Just full transparency about me, going a little far there. Does that answer your question, Christiana? Yeah, because there's no criteria, so it can be pretty subjective in that way. And as we know, one of kind of the components of addiction in many ways can be denial. So it's like when you're talking to family members and those close to the person, like what are their impressions? Because many times, well, as we know, the system can also be in denial. But that's something where your clinical judgment, you would be seeing, for example, it could be something where they're, regularly missing sessions, saying that they're really tired or they need to rest or something. They stayed up late the night before engaging in some kind of behavior. That's where you would probably bring that up to them and just have a conversation, though it may, again, may not quote meet criteria. Myra, did you have something?
Yes, but I forgot we were recording, so
would you guys feel more comfortable if I pause the recording while we do this? Since we're doing like personal reflections, I can do that. I'll do that. All right, so let's go ahead and get to the PowerPoint. What am I doing? All right. Oh boy. Okay. So as we know, and as we have, I think we share this sentiment of, addictions don't come out of thin air, and a lot of much of the kind of explanation or the contributing factors for an individual who has an addiction is environment. And many of the the roots of addiction can be traced back to family of origin or some sort of formative negative experience in one's childhood. So a history of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in the lives of many who practice compulsive behavior suggests the importance of environmental conditioning and reinforcement. So, hearkening back to some of the reasons why individuals engage in compulsive behaviors, and I'll stick to that today, because much of this is translatable to substance use, but I want to stick to the behaviors today, are a way of coping that at one point was adaptive, and as we know, addiction's very effective in getting you what you need quickly, predictably, and then over time, it essentially, erodes all kinds of things in one's life. So this individual, Dr. Jacobs, says almost all addicts, and I've talked to thousands of them in groups and individually, have said that they have a background in which they felt inferior, inadequate, guilty, ashamed, rejected, and unwanted. All of this is captured in this point phrase: no matter what I did, it was never enough. So as we know, negative affect, one of the driving forces for engaging in addictive behaviors, is probably very much connected to emotions that have been felt before, that are reminiscent to the moment that they are feeling right now, and they don't want to go there again. So, just bringing back memories of that emotion and wanting to run as quickly and as efficiently away from that as possible. All right, so let's go through some of the behaviors listed. So as we've stated, gambling addiction is the only process addiction that is in the DSM. And I just wanted to go through some of the phases and how, again, they are translatable in many ways to substance use, but there's different kind of purposes that people endorse for gambling. And that is individuals who are action seeking. So they engage in behaviors contradictory to their inner desire to escape. So this is essentially wanting to get that shot of serotonin, that shot of dopamine, a sense of excitement, and then escape seeking. So these are individuals who are often drawn to slot machines because, again, it's this very repetitive, or, you can push a button, repetitive movement. Because as we know with addiction, a lot of it is associated with behavioral cues too. So Joby, if it's okay for me to talk a little bit about what you shared in class of chocolate cake, of there's still that desire for the mouth to be occupied in some way, that there are other reasons for that addictions and behaviors are sustained. Individuals who are quitting smoking, for example, where they eat lots of, they suck on Jolly Ranchers, or they do something to keep their mouth occupied, because it's not just the use, it is the whole ritual of use as well. So that in escape seeking is kind of a way to just zone out, do something that's very repetitive, and drawn to gambling to escape emotions and boredom. Like I kind of alluded to, many experience blacking out with gambling, where, they just, all of a sudden they look up and it's 4 hours later and they've been sitting at the same slot machine the entire time. So for both, and again, as we know, with gambling, it's not really toward the end of the addiction. It's not really about the money. Same thing with shopping. It's not really about the items. With hoarding, it's not really about the items. It's, you know, about what it provides to you. So the goal is to stay in action and to escape reality as long as possible. The winning of the money is secondary. And one of the risks in gambling is that when an individual kind of reflects on their time, you know, kind of throughout their gambling career, that they really tend to remember those big wins and how exciting that was. And they don't really remember all of the losses and some of that, you know, subsequent turmoil. Piola.
So, you know how on ESPN, poker playing is a sport now?
Mhm.
I'm curious to know if that like hinders or like holds back people from accepting that it's an addiction versus it being, because I mean, if you're at that level, you have to be really good and practice makes perfect, sort of. So it's just like, where do you draw the line of like ethically this is okay for it to be classified as a sport, and ethically like these people probably need to get help?
Yeah, so that is actually a distinction of if you do this professionally, that it is not considered an addiction. Because it's a way of the individual making money, and so there is some literature on the differentiation between professional gambling and problematic gambling, that they're really, from what I understand, there's not a ton of overlap in the two, and unless anybody has done any other reading or knows anything differently from what I just said. Leanna.
Does this also apply to video games? Because I know that
Mhm.
some kids turned their addiction into a profit. My brother, for example.
Yeah. So gambling is the only, because it's in the DSM, that is the only one that like we could say something more like rooted in science with, that are rooted in evidence. Because video gaming and that kind of stuff is not in the DSM. I don't know that distinction is there. So I'm long-windedly saying I don't have a good answer for you. I think the logic could potentially be applied, but because it is not a diagnosis, that it would be difficult to differentiate. Great questions. Anything else? So we'll hearken back to some CBT of cognitive distortions being very common. So again, you know, if you're working with an individual who is struggling with gambling, it would not be uncommon for you, it would be quite common for you to experience what's called magical thinking. So the belief that thinking equates with doing, that it denies the validity of the laws of chance. As we know, the statistics in a casino are what they are. That there's ratios, there's intervals, you know, there's all these ways that the casino keeps you giving the house money. But with an individual with a gambling addiction, it's, well, I have, you know, red has hit 8 times in a row, it's got to be black next time. And as we know, it's a 50% chance every single time. So so red could hit 3,000 times in a row. That doesn't make black any more probable on the next spin. Also the gambler's fallacy, the belief that one can predict random events. I think that's also, I think that would constitute the example that I just gave incorrect, because the odds are the same as if there was no streak, like I said, hitting red several times in a row versus hitting black several times in a row. Or if the person simply picked random numbers. So, you know, people say, you know, 13 and 7 and 26 are my lucky numbers. You know, that's usually equated maybe to, so for me, like I really like the number 23. That was like my number in college. So I would, if I were to put a luck on the word luck on a number, it would probably be there. But I know logically that that's not necessarily a lucky number. It's not statistically more likely to be called for some kind of lottery. So then the individual, so these are just some characteristics that you might see or that, you know, your clients may engage in. And then there's phases to gambling addiction, where there's the winning phase, because usually gambling starts off as pretty recreational and pleasurable. Usually the bets are small, negligible, you know, they wouldn't lose their house or, you know, have to refinance or something if with the amount that they are gambling. Then there's the losing phase. Ultimately, the law of averages catches up to the lucky streak. So like I said, the statistics of winning on craps is what it is. On roulette, it is what it is. On blackjack, it is what it is. But an individual may have a higher winning percentage than the average. But ultimately they're going to come back. I always joke about this with basketball. So if a person, for example, shoots 50% from the free throw line, and for the game, they're shooting 75%, the likelihood that they're going to miss in any subsequent free throws is high, because the law of averages, they're making more than their average is. So they're probably going to make it back to their average. So if that didn't make sense to anybody, I could try again, but basketball is always my go-to for metaphors or examples. So in the losing phase, the individual will try to recoup their losses. And then this is where they may start chasing money. So they're realizing, oh man, like I might not be able to pay my rent this month. I might not be able to pay my car payment. And so they become more impulsive. You know, they're putting larger amounts of money to win their money back quickly. Which, as we know, impulsivity, impatience generally contributes to pretty bad decision-making. So then the individual enters into the desperation phase. So again, these are similar to like kind of the stages of grief. You know, it's not linear. None of the phases or stages that we ever talk about in our models are really ever linear. You can ebb and flow between these different phases and stages. This is just kind of a more general template. So for example, if you have a person coming to you seeking help in the desperation phase, I don't think it's fair for you to assume that they're like past the winning phase and losing phase, that they may, move through these phases in a nonlinear fashion. So desperation, this is where that criteria for a gambling addiction comes in, of loss of employment, loss of home, loss of property, loss of relationships, engaging in illegal activity to try to make money to be able to pay rent, mortgage, put food on the table, things like that. And then in this desperation phase too, so thinking about what is the purpose of gambling? Escape. Where do you go for that? You go to, a place of what's the word I'm looking for? Like when you're in a trance at the slot machine or something like that. So this individual may start fantasizing and have this kind of difficult to follow optimism of when I wake up tomorrow, it's a new day. It will be my lucky day. So this optimistic way of thinking, when the history and the trajectory of where they're going really doesn't substantiate or support that sense of optimism. So then an individual may enter into the giving up phase. So they stop believing they will win it all back. That fantasizing, that fantastical kind of thinking starts to diminish. So they stop believing they will win all the money back, but they still stay in action. So this is where, they're maybe maxing out credit cards to be able to still gamble when they don't have any money. But again, it's this escape. They want to get into their routine, get kind of locked into their behavioral trance, so they don't have to think. This is when individuals may enter into therapy or potentially involuntarily with increased suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And then you would get into the story of what precipitated that ideation or that attempt. And then hopefully, as they are in treatment, they'll enter into some stage of recovery of correcting some of these cognitive distortions. So again, erasing that magical thinking, not engaging in the gambler's fallacy, not thinking that just because you think something will happen, that it will be manifested. And this is where there's a difference with substance use treatment, because with recovery, some gamblers have a pretty big ego. And again, they tend to remember their winnings and not so much remember their losses. Again, that sense of entitlement of, I've invested so much money into this thing that I should recoup it. That there's this sense of entitlement of being able to recoup any losses, or an entitlement to be able to engage in this in like a harm reduction way or something like that, which may be possible. But these are some of the cognitive distortions that you would be working with an individual while they're in recovery. So compulsive shopping and buying. So this is, I think, like a quote from the book of an individual saying, a store is one of the few places we can get acceptance or get lost in a dream world, much like action-seeking and escape-seeking gamblers. All they need is cash, a credit card, or some checks. So, this is an individual who may not feel accepted or acknowledged in other spaces. And so, you get special treatment when you go into like some high-end stores and you start spending lots of money. You're treated very potentially differently than you are in your everyday life. So it's this sense of, and I think I've talked to you guys about this before. I know I said I'd stay on behaviors, but my experiences with cocaine use of, many of the individuals that I worked with said, I continued using because the people that I used with were the only ones that accepted me. And they were the only ones that didn't think I was a complete piece of garbage for what I did. Quite frankly, I was pretty popular in that community. I had some power and influence, and in the larger societal community, I'm not anything. So, it's like almost these pockets of spaces that individuals create to feel a sense of importance, of belonging, of power. And that's really at the crux of a lot of the addictions that people engage in. So there's a dissonance between their real self and ideal self. For those of you who may not be familiar with this, your ideal self is like who you aspire to be. I'm sure many of you have goals for yourself in terms of professional, personal, relational, all financial, all of these things. So this is, if you could craft like kind of the perfect life for yourself, what would it look like? And then your real self is, where are you at today? And taking like a very honest inventory of that. And then what you would be working on is, this is like an intervention I'll do with clients where I'll create a t-shirt, like an outline of a t-shirt, and they can draw, whether it's like images or put in words of what constitutes their real self, what constitutes their ideal self. You usually start with the ideal self, just so y'all know, then go with the real self. And then the question is, are you engaging in behaviors and doing things that facilitate movement towards your ideal self, knowing that sometimes the ideal self isn't attainable. But anyway, so the dissonance is there. They believe that buying and acquiring things will bring them closer to their ideal self. So, if I buy this $3,000 suit, that I will be respected, that I will get the job that I may not really be qualified for because of how I appear. If I acquire enough things, I will fill the hole of loneliness in my heart, that kind of stuff. So then there's hoarding. So as we know from the DSM, hoarding is considered a compulsive, obsessive, within the category of obsessive compulsive behaviors. So many times with an individual who hoards, it can be out of anxiety as well of, like for any of you who watch the show, well, actually, let me stop my share. How many of you have seen the show Hoarders? So essentially what happens is a camera crew kind of exploits the mental health issues of an individual, where they bring in like a person who is a professional organizer, and then usually a clinical psychologist, because clinical psychologists are individuals who tend to work more with like DSM diagnoses. So many of the stories of the individuals is of loss, where, you know, they've acquired a lot of things after the loss of a loved one, after the death of a loved one, a divorce, you know, just loss in general. So they acquire these things and have a very deep attachment to it, and a big fear of losing the items, because it's not even necessarily about, as we know, it's not really about the items, it's about what the items represent. But as we know, many times individuals can be, you know, evicted from homes, they're like deemed unlivable, things like that. But it generally is around loss and trauma, where the thought is that there's safety in having, acquiring large amounts of stuff to the point where you can't really even occupy living spaces within your home. So for those of you who haven't seen Hoarders, the show Hoarders, it's heartbreaking. Like, these are individuals who are really, really struggling. They're very isolated. They don't allow people in their home because, you know, on some level, they know this isn't really a way to live. They have no access to their beds. They may sleep on a pile of clothes or even a pile of garbage in their home. Sometimes people have so much stuff that they have to like crawl up to the top of door openings. Like, they can only get to different places in their home. So when they crawl, they have no working toilet, no working sink. The refrigerator hasn't had food in it, or it does have food in it that expired years ago because they don't use their refrigerator. So it's just, there's a lot that's going on. But I say all of that to say that when there is space to have conversation about, you know, some events that may contribute to this, it's almost always trauma, loss of some sort. Does anyone have any like comments or anything additional to share about that, or any questions? If you haven't seen it, I would encourage, I think it's an accurate depiction, although I always have a difficult time when you put on camera people suffering. So that's just it's like a tug of war within myself of like, this is accurate information. It's also inherently exploitative because I don't know if these people get paid for being on film. They should.
I did have a question about, like, since we brought up the show, I have never seen a therapist like involved with like the family and stuff. So is that something that you think, because I always wondered like why they never involved a family therapist for family like situations. It just never. Okay, so I was wondering what your opinion is on that. Is there a specific reason that they only use the clinical psychologist? Like,
yes, I think so. Because, so as we know, this is where a big bias is going to come out from me of being very proud of the way that we conceptualize stuff as marriage and family therapists. I think it's a absolute limitation of clinical psychology, is they look at the issue as intrapsychic. So they engage the family in like a rescuing of this individual, when I would argue that they are just as much part of it as the individual. They may not be engaging in the accumulation of things, but I mean, these are family members. If any of you haven't seen the show, the family members can be very, very mean and very impatient with the individual and like shaming them of like, this is a a gallon of milk that expired 3 years ago. Why are you carrying it? And just like no compassion for the individual. So there's very little coaching of the family as well. But I couldn't agree with you more, Sarah, I really think that the way that we tend to presenting issues with an individual is the appropriate way of bringing in as many people as possible. But I think by virtue of the individual being a clinical psychologist, their training is inherently intrapsychic. So they're going to be looking at how do I heal the individual with the quote help of the family. And really all the family is doing in those situations is helping move out items. So to me, the intervention is very incomplete. So all you're going to get from me, Sarah, is frustration that they don't engage in that way. Piola.
I'm not sure. I know like in the show, they only show like that weekend, like from Friday through Sunday of like the cleanup.
Yeah.
Do they like, I'm curious to know like if they actually continue therapy afterwards, because if they don't, then like it's sort of ineffective, correct?
Right. So they offer it and very few people engage in it.
Okay.
So they do offer aftercare. But I don't know the process so much, because my understanding is these are individuals who haven't had any like orientation to mental health. So they don't really have like a relationship with the psychologist who comes in. They don't have a relationship with the organizer or whatever the other professional is, because they're not always just an organizer. So it's this like huge change over a very short period of time. And then it's like, oh, and by the way, you can do some aftercare. So I just think the whole process is pretty truncated in that, like, I would argue that it would be months and months of talking about whatever is going on, talking about the process of starting to do anything different, living any differently. But usually, unfortunately, what happens is these are people who are in like dire straits. So they're days away from getting kicked out of their house. They are days away from losing something that they need. So then this is kind of almost like this crisis intervention that comes in. And so I don't know if that's a reason why, because I think unfortunately a lot of how it's kind of framed in the show is that it's just resistance. They didn't really buy into the process. And I think it's potentially the approach of like, this was all of these people came into my space, shook my world up. This wasn't what I thought it was going to be. And now I am hurting and I'm just expected to go and meet with a separate professional, because this is the professionals who come in are usually like flown in from a different location, and then they have to engage in services locally. So again, with another stranger. So I don't know that it's best practice.
I just feel like it's like an intervention, but at least like on the show Intervention, they have the option of like going away for like an X amount of time, usually at least for like a month, to like a rehab facility. But I feel like with Hoarders, it's like they're putting a Band-Aid on like a bigger issue.
Sure. So, and that's kind of all they're doing is trying to make a space livable, trying to have it so the individual passes some kind of inspection to be able to still stay in that home before it's demolished or, everything's burned.
Mhm.
But yeah, so, and then as you guys know, I also have issues with the treatment facilities too. So I would argue that intervention is also relatively useless. But I do think that the Hoarders shows an accurate depiction of how life can be for an individual who is struggling with that. Anything else? All right. So as I kind of alluded to, hoarding is the collecting or accumulating of items that the individual believes has worth, It provides some self-esteem, some comfort. I think one of the individuals shared that I think that they had been robbed or something like that. So they essentially created a fortress for their home with all of the stuff so that they wouldn't be robbed again. So they thought that the things would deter an individual from coming in, or at least make it very difficult for somebody to come in again and rob them. So there's anxiety in removing any of the items. So many times it's trash, it's food containers, like these things that have no worth, but that are just taking up space in an individual's dwelling. Sometimes people even purchase storage units. They store things out in their yard. So it's every square inch of what they have, it is stored with things or filled with things. There is generally a belief that there's a value, like some kind of hidden value. Maybe somebody will have collectibles that they really haven't kept in very good shape, but they believe that it will be worth something later, that someone will find value in that. And so they believe that throwing it away would be, kind of setting themselves up for some kind of failure later or missing out on something later. And then throwing it away is akin to clashing with some of their dreams. So this is similar to that magical thinking of compulsive behaviors or gamblers that we talked about in 2 slides ago. And then often the objects collected are connected to memories of enjoyable childhood experiences or feelings, and the individual has a desire to recreate those feelings. So again, the objects are representative of something else. All right, so moving to sexual addiction. So this is where I'm gonna tee this up for you guys. We will go ahead and take our last break, and then I got some questions for y'all to talk about. So sexual addiction, the definition again, sexual addiction is not in the DSM. However, paraphilias are in the DSM, and I've got all kinds of feelings about paraphilia. So I want to offer that up to you guys as well. So these are the notes that I don't have on your slides because I looked them up over the, I'll do this over the break. But anyway, I will copy and paste this into the chat so you guys have all of these notes. So a sexual addiction is engaging in persistent and escalating patterns of sexual behavior acted out despite increasing negative consequences to self and others. So again, this could be infidelity. This could be something like engaging in some kind of exhibitionist type behavior where there's, potential criminal and legal consequences. The object of sexually addicted behavior can be the pursuit of pleasure and or the desire to subdue pain or anxiety. Many interviews that are conducted with individuals who have a sexual addiction, it's really not about, for many, it's not about the sex at all. It's about figuratively filling something within themselves where they feel like they are inept in some way, unworthy in some way, but it's or they're engaged. It's really in many ways no different than engaging in kind of a trance-like behavior to just escape. Most significant is a lack of control over the behavior and a continuation of the behavior despite adverse consequences, and the continuing obsession with engaging in, planning, or simply thinking about the behavior. So you can see some of that ritualistic nature to this as well. So again, it's not just about engaging in the behavior, it's the preparation of that. It's the actual engaging in the behavior is only a proportion of the time spent thinking about, fantasizing about, planning for, seeking. So I'm just, for an individual with a sexual addiction, it may be, hours engaging in, finding a potential person to engage sexually. And that could be hours of looking on sites, that could be, going to the same store to get condoms or to get some kind of contraception. You know, there's all of the parts of this can't be overlooked in the overall addiction. And then what I will tee you all up for over the break with this is your thoughts on the DSM paraphilias. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar, or to jog your memory, there are 8 paraphilic disorders. There's voyeurism, exhibitionism, frauderism, sexual masochism, sexual sadism, pedophiliism, fetishism, and transvestism. So I am curious about your thoughts on these. I've defined them for you as well. So if you're unfamiliar with them, you will have that information. And then after, I will share some of my thoughts on these different paraphilias. This is, so to be incredibly transparent with you, the sexual disorders portion of the DSM is where I think the DSM gets it super wrong. So that's just my personal opinion. I hope that that doesn't sway you too much, because I really want you guys to engage in honest conversation about this. So just going over each of the paraphilias and, you know, how you might navigate that with when an individual presents in that way. What do you think of the actual existence of that in a diagnostic and statistical manual? So what are your thoughts in general on each of them? And then how might you feel about an individual presenting to you with that? So we'll go to break. We'll come back together at 8:07, and then I'll put y'all in breakout rooms for a little while to discuss this.